Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we have some great news to share with our viewers, and that's surrounding the situation with 400 series AMD motherboards and future CPU support, namely Zen 3. This entire debacle has been generating a lot of discussion from everyone in the community over the past few weeks, whether that's Reddit, social posts, YouTube videos, and so on. Lots of thoughts, lots of angry comments, lots of defending AMD, and lots of talk on the technical reasons behind the decision. Well, today we have some good news. AMD has decided to reverse their decision, and they will now be supporting Zen 3 processors on 400 series motherboards. This is an official move by AMD that they will be talking about publicly from today. I expect there will be a blog post about it published right around when this video will go live. We'll link that below and we'll also talk about all of that in a moment. First, a quick recap for those out of the loop, super quick I promise. Alongside the launch of new Ryzen 3 CPUs a few weeks back, AMD also discussed further details about their upcoming B450 motherboards. Part of this information included a slide that revealed only X470 and B450 motherboards would support Zen 3 processors officially, leaving 400 and 300 series owners without support. After an AMD blog post discussing the matter, further discussions with AMD themselves, as well as off-the-record talks with board partners, we and many other outlets discovered that this was a hard lock. No Zen 3 CPUs would be supported, not officially, not unofficially, not from OEMs, no support, period. This angered many people in the community, particularly those who had bought a B450 motherboard alongside a Zen 2 processor, because this was now effectively a dead-end platform, and those buyers bought a motherboard for only a single generation of CPU. This was despite AMD misleading the public into thinking B450 boards would be supported into the future, saying they were a great alternative to X570 for budget buyers around the launch of Zen 2. MSI was also caught up in the storm because they specifically advertised their B450 Max motherboards as supporting future AM4 processors, and in fact had designed these boards with future chips in mind. After a lot of blowback from the community and board partners, presumably MSI leading the charge given their predicament with the Max series, we now come to today. AMD have, in the past few days, changed their mind and have decided to continue supporting Zen 3 processors on at least 400 series motherboards. This means that contrary to their initial stance, they will be providing board partners the necessary code for Zen 3 support on these boards. Let's talk the details here, because AMD's statement includes a number of different points that will make this solution a bit different to its previous generations. The first 2 points are: we will develop and enable our motherboard partners with the code to support Zen 3 based processors in select beta BIOSes for AMD B450 and X470 motherboards. These optional BIOS updates will disable support for many existing AMD Ryzen desktop processor models to make the necessary ROM space available. So what this means is that AMD will be supporting 400 series chipsets, but not 300 series chipsets. And I think this was widely expected for this generation anyway, and getting 3 generations of support from B350, from Zen through to Zen 2, I think is a pretty good outcome. AMD have also confirmed here that the BIOS update will disable support for existing desktop processors, citing ROM size issues. Our understanding is that it will be up to the board partners to decide which CPUs will be cut. This would allow MSI, for example, to offer support for all CPUs with their Max motherboards, while another vendor only using a 16MB ROM would have to cut support for potentially, say, Zen and Zen Plus CPUs. It hasn't been confirmed exactly what lines will need to make way for Zen 3, but AMD is setting the tone now and informing users that cuts will happen. The third point is: the select beta BIOSes will enable a one-way upgrade path for AMD Ryzen processors with Zen 3 coming later this year. Flashing back to an older BIOS version will not be supported. Now this is an interesting point, and one that's potentially risky if the BIOS update doesn't go to plan, but the thinking here is clearly that you should only update your motherboard if you have a Zen 3 processor on hand, and they're not making it possible to go backwards with this. To reduce the potential confusion, our intent is to offer BIOS downloads only to verified customers of 400 series motherboards who have purchased a new desktop processor with Zen 3 inside. This will help us ensure the customers have a bootable processor on hand after the BIOS flash, minimizing the risk a user could get caught in a no boot situation. Now this is the biggest news of all in AMD's statement. One of the big concerns with offering Zen 3 support on older motherboards, especially given some of these updates will need to remove support for older processors, is that some less experienced users will accidentally perform a BIOS update that removes support for their CPU. AMD doesn't want this to happen and potentially sour the experience for those that otherwise are happy with their system and CPU choice. So the solution here is an interesting one in that you won't be able to see or download these beta BIOS updates unless you confirm that you have a Zen 3 CPU. I asked AMD for details on how this would happen, but they're still working through the systems now and we'll have more to share later. But in locking away these BIOSes to Zen 3 owners, it significantly reduces the chance that a novice user will perform a BIOS update that bricks their system. It also firmly establishes who these beta BIOSes are for, the enthusiast users who know what they're doing and want to get a bit more out of their 400 series board without having to buy something new. I actually think this is a really good solution that takes into account many different user types in the market and tries to cater to them all. Enthusiasts can download the BIOS at their own risk and enable support. Novice users can't accidentally brick their board or buy a new 400 series board that has removed support for older chips because the update is locked away. I think the solution also highlights that while there are some concerns around the user experience, particularly for those outside, say, the hardware unboxed enthusiast crowd, it's never been an insurmountable or critical issue. There are things that can be done to mitigate the issues while continuing to deliver what AMD effectively promised. Timing and availability of the BIOS updates will vary and may not immediately coincide with the availability of the first Zen 3 based processors. This is another good move and will hopefully prevent another Zen 2 on 400 series board situation where a lot of BIOS updates were released hastily and with problems. Setting the expectation that 400 series support will come later, hopefully in a more polished state, should ensure people don't explode in rage when Zen 3 BIOS updates aren't immediately available. AMD is warning you now. This is the final pathway AMD can enable for 400 series motherboards to add new CPU support. CPU releases beyond Zen 3 will require a new motherboard, and AMD continues to recommend that customers choose an AMD 500 series motherboard for the best performance and features with our new CPUs. These points as well suggest that AMD are already learning from their lessons. They're informing people now that 400 series boards will not receive updates beyond Zen 3. They're setting good expectations now and letting people know what is happening in the future so that people don't get burned with the purchase down the line. AMD also say that we can expect another blog post in the future that will provide the remaining details and a walkthrough of the specific process. So with the key points from AMD out of the way, first of all, obviously this is a great move from AMD and full credit to them for changing their mind based on what amounted to perfectly valid feedback from the community. Occasionally places like Reddit enjoy blowing up over pretty minor issues, but on this one, we feel that the reaction was justified given the number of people who were about to get burned hard on a product purchase. Listening to community feedback, taking it on board, and coming to the right decision is what good companies do, particularly when it was the company shafting buyers in the first place. And often it can be a hard decision that has ramifications for them and partners, but by continuing to provide the support they promised from the beginning, hopefully AMD can restore some trust and retain the goodwill that they've built up over several years through the rise and release period. I also want to say that achieving this result is exactly why we made our original video. Our entire goal as a YouTube channel is to create content for you, the viewers, in support of the wider PC community. We always take the side of the consumer in these battles, and really any time that there are injustices, we will fight hard to ensure that the consumer is the one coming out on top, because it's you guys buying the hardware, handing over your hard-earned cash, and the last thing we want to see are you guys getting burnt in the process, like what was going to happen with this situation. So from time to time, that means we need to criticize companies like AMD to pull them up on bad choices, and in particular, statements that are misleading like was the case here. It's something we will continue to do with any similar issues, whether it's Zen 3 support on B450 boards, or other things we've fought to resolve, such as the problems with ASUS's tough and Strix RX 5700 XT graphics cards, or weak X470 VRMs. The support we get from you, particularly our Patreon members, but really anyone who watches our videos, allows us to make these sorts of videos without fear of serious repercussions. Now, we don't want to take full credit for resolving this issue because we definitely don't have that sort of influence. It's a joint effort between all of us in the community to get these things resolved, and I'm sure some internal blowback from partners helped out too. But it is nice to see feedback being taken on board in a genuine manner. Again, kudos to AMD on that one. The response here from AMD also seems to have really considered a number of the issues faced with allowing 400 series support, and the solution seems to be a good one that balances these concerns. Their statement also clearly sets expectations and informs the community of what is going on. It's a beta BIOS, it won't come straight away, it's the final one for these motherboards. This sort of messaging is fantastic and really gives buyers important information that could shape the parts they choose if they're planning an upgrade or new PC build. So I want to spend the rest of this video talking about some of the reasoning behind this decision. We'll talk both about the initial decision and the reversal and some of the overall ramifications that this will have on the ecosystem. Firstly, there's been a lot of discussion about the technical reasons AMD was supposedly unable to support Zen 3 on older motherboards. AMD initially brought out the line about BIOS size limitations, although people quickly discovered that this wasn't quite the insurmountable technical hurdle that AMD portrayed it to be, especially with boards like MSI's Max series being designed specifically for this eventuality. Since then, there have been other reasons that have come to light, and credit to Gamers Nexus for digging into some of those reasons. One is that some older CPUs cannot address a BIOS larger than 16 megabytes, meaning board partners have to petition their larger 32 megabyte BIOSes if they want to support some older CPU generations. Another is that OEMs have tiny BIOS teams, sometimes just one person, so creating forked BIOSes and supporting them across multiple motherboards is too difficult. Many of these aren't hard limitations or roadblocks per se, but complications that make it difficult to support future CPU generations on 400 series boards and older. Now, I have no reason to doubt these technical challenges, and I'm sure everything that's been mentioned is valid, and in fact, we were told that even just getting Zen 2 to run on these boards was difficult. AMD has even reiterated in today's blog post the considerable technical challenges that they are facing. So there are absolutely issues being faced in engineering teams at AMD and at board partners to support Zen 3 processors. But I think this latest decision from AMD raises some important points. One that springs to mind is, okay, so there are technical challenges, but how serious are they in practice? And are they serious enough to just can support entirely and renege on a promise? Now, judging by AMD's, let's say, reluctant willingness to reverse course and support future CPUs on existing boards, I think it's clear that these technical issues are not a significant enough roadblock to fully ban support in the way AMD were planning. It may cost board partners and AMD both time and money to implement support, but it's not a situation where the problems are insurmountable or at the very least problematic enough to drop support. And this is actually what we were told in our initial round of off-the-record conversations with board partners. Yes, there are plenty of technical challenges and the BIOS size limitation doesn't make integrating future CPU support simple, but we were expressly told by some people that their company already had plans in place to deal with these hurdles and ultimately wanted to provide support if it wasn't for AMD preventing it from happening. But more importantly, and I think this is absolutely crucial to this discussion, the choices a company makes should never burden the consumer. The consumer shouldn't be the one bearing the ultimate pain and price of AMD's implied promise, but then inability to deliver due to technical reasons, no matter how valid those reasons are. It's just not the consumer's fault. The burden is squarely on the shoulders of the companies that made the claims and promises in the first place. In this case, that's AMD, and by extension, the board partners who signed up. They are the ones that should be facing the financial cost of fixing the issues, not the consumer who otherwise would have had to buy a new motherboard when they didn't expect to. Even if there are lots of technical and logistical challenges involved, when a company markets or heavily implies something about their products and uses that to sell a ton of chips, it's their obligation to deliver on what they said. It honestly doesn't matter how difficult it would be. If it's not impossible, they have an obligation to get it done. And if it is impossible, they have to find a way to remedy the situation, like a refund, for example. Claiming there are issues, calling it all too hard and packing up shop, but then leaving the consumer to pay the price, well, it just isn't good enough. And I'm glad AMD has seen this as an error as well. And I think this is ultimately what it boils down to. There was a cost associated with implementing support, whether that's to fund BIOS engineers creating and maintaining two BIOS versions, whether that's partitioning existing BIOSes and the complications involved with that, or whether it's creating the code package for board partners in the first place. It's a cost that wasn't willing to be paid by billion-dollar companies and was going to burden the wrong people. And ironically, while OEMs likely would have saved engineering dollars in not supporting Zen 3 on their older motherboards, they were set to face significant costs in other areas of the business due to this decision. In fact, one partner told us that AMD's initial decision has already cost them money in the form of an increase in support requests and RMAs for their products. After the decision was announced and this whole thing spread through the community, there was an influx of people wanting their money back for 400 series boards that were now going to be unsupported. The other thing that has been talked about is the whole market confusion angle, which is something AMD and board partners are now set to face given the backflip decision. But we've discussed in the past why we don't think this was a compelling reason to prevent updates. You end up with one of two situations. You allow BIOS updates on existing boards, but some people have problems or are confused by the process, or you block BIOS updates and you force everyone to buy a new motherboard. Given one of the two options locks everyone into spending more money with their next CPU upgrade, we will always take the option that doesn't cost some users money. Yes, the trade-off is some people will run into problems, but that feels like a good trade-off for what is ultimately a better platform. And this is a big reason why the initial decision annoyed us. Removing consumer choice, especially a choice that was promised and effectively advertised, is usually a bad thing. But luckily, everyone has reached the best decision here, so we end up with the better of the two sides. AMD has even taken steps to ensure that we have the least amount of market confusion, the least number of problems and pain in the upgrade process as possible. Again, I think AMD's response has shown that this isn't a killer issue for including support. There are solutions, and AMD has attempted to find one, and I actually think that they've settled on something that's quite reasonable. In the aftermath of this debacle, I'm sure AMD has learned some serious lessons about marketing. If it was their intention to end support for older motherboards with new CPU generations, they needed to be much clearer in their messaging, informing people of this decision earlier in the process and without making promises that they can't keep. The path they took from the beginning meant they couldn't reverse course like they were attempting to without alienating the user base and drawing criticism for misleading advertising. With an expected socket change coming up in the next few years, it will be very interesting to see how AMD talks about their next generation platform and what sorts of promises they make. AMD probably won't make the mistake of promising 4 years of socket support again if they aren't absolutely sure that they can deliver. Personally, I'd be sad to see AMD end their multi-year socket compatibility because it has been a key selling point throughout this generation. It's been far from a smooth, headache-free ecosystem, but every issue along the way has been an opportunity to learn and improve the process for next time around. Ideally, they'd take these lessons and, with the next socket, develop a more robust platform with a similar multi-generation compatibility goal, but based on what AMD attempted with this generation, that seems a bit optimistic right now, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a more Intel-like approach. In the shorter term, we are likely to face some familiar issues with the Zen 3 CPU launch. All motherboards, not just 400 series, will require a BIOS update to support these new CPUs. That includes B450 and X470 boards, which were originally the only supported chipsets. How OEMs handle this and whether the process is smoother than with Zen 2 remains to be seen, but again, hopefully lessons have been learned. It'll also be interesting to see how OEMs go about updating 400 series boards given all the constraints that have now been documented. We did hear some unique solutions to this from some partners, such as a CPU support selection toggle at some point during the process, among other things, so we'll see how that goes. Will they implement them in addition to AMD's verification process? That's up in the air. Will all boards get support? Who knows? But at the end of the day, providing support is the better path to head down and the one that benefits the consumer the most. For now, I think we can put this issue to bed. AMD made a wrong decision, they listened to the community, now has corrected course. We'll see how AMD ends up delivering these updates when Zen 3 comes around, but for now, no reason to throw out that B450 board just yet. It isn't a dead-end platform anymore. And yeah, that's it for this one. Hopefully we don't have to make any future videos on B450 boards and Zen 3 support, and really I don't think either Steve or I actually expected AMD to backflip on this one. All the messaging we were hearing from them and board partners and all the issues and technical challenges popping up made us think that this was here to stay, but yeah, pretty glad that AMD has come to this decision and listened to some community feedback. I mentioned earlier that we really appreciate the support of our Patreon members. It makes making videos and investigations like this possible because yeah, it's not really something that you can put ads in. It's not really something that makes these companies happy, but we do what we do for you guys, for the consumer. We mentioned that earlier, and money that we get from the Patreon really helps out in that regard. So it's a great thing to sign up, and we really appreciate everyone that does so. And yeah, we got some big reviews coming up in the next few days, so it's well worth subscribing to the channel for that one, and I'll catch you in the next one.